When we think of Ulysses S. Grant, the image is almost monolithic. We see the victor of Appomattox. We see the man who saved the Union, the stoic general chewing on a cigar while the world burned around him. He is a marble statue of integrity in a time of chaos. But statues cast long shadows. And if you look into the shadows of Grant's presidency, particularly the second term, you don't find marble, you find mud. Deep, expensive, bourbon-soaked mud. That is a perfect description. We are diving into the 1870s today, the Gilded Age, a time when Mark Twain famously said the country was gilded, meaning it looked like gold on the outside, but underneath it was made of cheap, rotting material. And nothing epitomizes that rot quite like the story we are telling today. This is the story of the whiskey ring. And let's be clear right off the bat. This wasn't just a few moonshiners in the backwoods dodging a tax collector. This was an industrial-scale conspiracy. Exactly. This was a machine built of distillers, rectifiers, storekeepers, IRS agents, and politicians, reaching all the way into the private office of the President of the United States. They didn't just steal pocket change, they stole millions. And in doing so, they nearly destroyed the reputation of the man who saved the country. It is a story of betrayal, secret codes, midnight raids, and a president who loved his friends entirely too much. Welcome to the scandal that defined an era. This is the story of the whiskey ring. To understand the heist, we have to understand the environment. The year is 1870. The Civil War has been over for 5 years, but the bill is still due. Wars are incredibly expensive, and the Union had racked up enormous debt. Right. Before the war, federal taxes were barely a thing for the average person. But to fund the war machine, the government created the Bureau of Internal Revenue in 1862, and they taxed everything: income, inheritance, tobacco, and, most lucratively, distilled spirits. The tax on whiskey was astronomical. At one point during the war, it hit $2 a gallon. Now, to put that in perspective, the cost to actually manufacture a gallon of whiskey was only roughly 20 to 30 cents, so the tax was almost 10 times the cost of the product, which creates an immediate, massive incentive to cheat. If you can sell a gallon of whiskey without paying the tax, your profit margin isn't just double, it's exponential. It is instant wealth. Precisely. But you can't do it alone. You need the people watching the warehouse to look the other way. This brings us to the political climate. The spoils system was in full swing. To the victor belonged the spoils. Politicians appointed their friends to government jobs, not based on competence, but on loyalty. And the epicenter of this specific brand of corruption was St. Louis, Missouri. St. Louis was a boomtown, a gateway to the West, and a massive hub for liquor distillation. And sitting atop the federal hierarchy in St. Louis was a man named General John McDonald. John McDonald is a character right out of a Scorsese movie. He was a rough-and-tumble guy, a Union veteran who knew Grant from the Vicksburg campaign. He wasn't appointed supervisor of Internal Revenue because he was a brilliant accountant. He was appointed because he was Grant's pal. Grant liked him, Grant trusted him, and McDonald took that trust and monetized it immediately. He realized that if he controlled the inspectors, the gaugers as they were called, he could dictate exactly how much tax was collected and how much disappeared. But he needed a structure. He didn't just want bribes, he wanted a syndicate. So the ring was formed. It wasn't a loose association. It was organized like a corporation. You had the distillers, the ones making the whiskey. You had the rectifiers, the ones bottling and blending it. And you had the officials. Here is how the money was split. It was colloquially known as the illicit fund. For every gallon of illicit whiskey sold, the tax evasion profit was split. The distiller kept about 40 to 50% to cover their risk. The rest went into the ring's war chest. And from that chest, payouts were distributed weekly. The storekeepers got paid. The gaugers got paid, the local politicians got paid, and crucially, a significant portion was sent to Washington, D.C., to ensure that no one in the Treasury Department looked too closely at St. Louis. It was a perfect ecosystem. The distillers got rich, the agents got rich, and the politicians used the money to fund campaigns. They justified it by saying the money was necessary to keep the Republican Party, the party that saved the Union, in power. It was corruption masked as patriotism. Let's get into the mechanics, the actual how of the theft, because it is fascinatingly simple and brazen. The government required tax stamps. When a barrel of whiskey was filled, a gauger measured the proof and volume, and they slapped a tax stamp on the barrel to prove the tax was paid. The stamp was supposed to be destroyed when the barrel was emptied, but the ring realized, what if we just don't destroy it? What if we carefully take it off and send it back to the distiller? Exactly. They were recycling stamps. One paid talk stamp could cover 4, 5, or 10 barrels of whiskey, but they got even lazier than that. Eventually, the gaugers just stopped counting. They would report that a distillery produced, say, 10,000 gallons that month, when in reality, they produced 50,000. The surplus 40,000 gallons went out the back door, tax-free. They called this high wines. The distilleries would run normally during the day, producing the legal taxed liquor, but at night, the lights stayed on. They ran crooked shifts. The whiskey produced at night didn't exist on paper, and everyone felt safe because the fix was in at the very top. This brings us to the man standing next to the president, Orville Babcock. This is the villain of our story, or perhaps the dark enabler. Babcock was Grant's private secretary. He had been on Grant's staff during the war. He was the one who actually met Lee to arrange the surrender at Appomattox. Grant loved Babcock. He treated him like a son. He lived in the White House. He screened Grant's mail. He controlled who got to see the president. And, unbeknownst to Grant, Babcock was the ring's eyes and ears in Washington. Whenever the Treasury Department planned an audit or an investigation into St. Louis, Babcock would find out. He would send encrypted telegrams to McDonald in St. Louis warning them. They used code names. The investigators were called wolves or visitors. The fraud was called traffic. But in 1874, the game changed. Grant appointed a new Secretary of the Treasury, Benjamin Bristow. Bristow was different. He was a Kentuckian, a Union veteran, but he was a reformer. He was ambitious, and he was absolutely dogmatic about corruption. He looked at the tax revenue numbers and realized the math didn't add up. Bristow saw that whiskey consumption in the U.S. was rising, but tax revenue was flat or falling. He knew he was being robbed, but when he tried to send inspectors to St. Louis, they always came back saying everything was clean. He realized the inspectors were either being bribed or the targets were being warned. So Bristow went rogue. He bypassed the entire internal revenue structure. He hired private detectives and changed the cipher codes used by the Treasury so Babcock couldn't read the dispatches. He essentially ran a covert operation within his own government. This is spy novel stuff. Bristow's agents went to St. Louis disguised as merchants. They watched the loading docks. They counted the barrels leaving the warehouses and compared them to the official reports. The discrepancy was undeniable. They gathered evidence for months. Then came the strike. May 10, 1875. Bristow coordinated a massive simultaneous raid across St. Louis, Chicago, and Milwaukee. He didn't use the local marshals because he knew they were corrupt. He brought in outside agents. They seized dozens of distilleries and rectifying houses in a single day. The ring was caught completely off guard. The telegrams from Babcock hadn't come in time because Bristow had locked down the information. The seizures were massive. Records were seized before they could be burned. And in those records, they found the paper trail leading back to Washington. They found correspondence. They found the ledger books of the illicit fund. And most damningly, they found the telegrams from Sylph. Sylph was the code name Babcock used in his communications with the ringleaders. One telegram in particular became the smoking gun. It read, "I have succeeded. They will not go." The Sylph. This was Babcock bragging that he had stopped an investigation. When Grant was shown this evidence, his reaction was complicated. At first, Grant sounded like a reformer. He famously wrote a note on a dispatch saying, "Let no guilty man escape if it can be avoided." It became the slogan of the prosecution. But as the investigation moved closer to Babcock, Grant's tone shifted. Grant could not believe Babcock was guilty. He viewed it as a political attack on himself. He started to see Bristow not as a dutiful public servant, but as a rival who wanted the presidency. The ring members in St. Louis, including McDonald, were convicted and sent to prison. But Babcock, Grant decided to fight for him. This is unprecedented in American history. The President of the United States volunteered to be a character witness for a defendant in a criminal trial for defrauding the government. Grant wanted to go to St. Louis to testify in person. His cabinet had to physically talk him out of it. They told him it was unseemly and dangerous for a sitting president to appear in a criminal court. So they compromised. Grant gave a deposition at the White House. The Chief Justice was there. The Attorney General was there. Grant swore under oath that Babcock was a man of unshakable integrity. That deposition was read to the jury in St. Louis. Think about being a juror in 1876. The man who won the Civil War, the sitting president, is telling you this guy is innocent. It tipped the scales. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the telegrams, the testimony of co-conspirators, Babcock was acquitted. He was acquitted in a court of law, but not in the court of public opinion. The evidence had been made public. Everyone knew he was guilty. Grant forced Babcock to resign as his private secretary, but the damage was done. The whiskey ring confirmed the public's worst fears about the Grant administration, that it was rotting from the head down. And the fallout for Bristow, the man who actually stopped the theft? Grant forced him out of the cabinet. Grant essentially fired the guy who saved the Treasury millions because he prosecuted Grant's friend. It was a masterclass in misplaced loyalty. The scandal sapped the moral authority of the Republican Party. It distracted the country from Reconstruction. People in the North became tired of Grantism and corruption, leading them to retreat from the efforts to protect civil rights in the South. The corruption of the whiskey ring didn't just steal money, it helped steal the political will to enforce equality. In the end, the whiskey ring is a lesson in the dangers of the spoils system and the blindness of personal loyalty in high office. Millions were stolen, careers were ruined, and a presidency was permanently stained. It remains one of the greatest financial conspiracies in American history, hidden in the bottom of a barrel. If you want to uncover more dirty secrets of the Gilded Age that history books gloss over, make sure to hit that subscribe button. We have plenty more scandals to uncork. Thanks for listening.
That is an incredible incentive to cheat. It effectively turned tax evasion into the most profitable part of the whiskey business. If you were an honest distiller paying the full 70 cents, you were at a massive competitive disadvantage. You couldn't price your liquor low enough to compete with the guys who were skimming. So the system didn't just encourage corruption, it practically mandated it. If you wanted to survive in St. Louis or Chicago in the 1870s, you almost had to join the ring. But how did they physically do it? You can't exactly hide thousands of barrels of whiskey in your pocket. It required a complex ballet of bureaucracy and bribery. The government had a system of checks in place, or so they thought. Every distillery was assigned 2 federal officials, a storekeeper and a gauger. The storekeeper's job was to oversee the grain coming in and the mash being made, effectively estimating how much whiskey should be produced. The gauger's job was to measure the final product, the high wines, and apply the tax stamps to the barrels. These stamps were like banknotes. They were proof that the 70 cents per gallon had been paid. Once the stamp was affixed and canceled, usually by cutting it or writing over it, the barrel could legally leave the warehouse. So for the ring to work, you couldn't just bribe one person. You had to own the storekeeper, so he would underreport the amount of grain entering the facility. Then you had to own the gauger, so he would report that a barrel contained, say, 30 gallons when it actually contained 40, or better yet, let barrels leave the warehouse with no stamps at all, or stamps that had been chemically washed and reused. This was the genius of the operation. It wasn't a smash-and-grab robbery, it was an administrative coup. They turned the federal agents, the very men sworn to protect the Treasury, into employees of the criminal enterprise. Exactly. And the money was distributed with corporate efficiency. This wasn't a few guys splitting a sock of cash in an alley. They had a payroll. The illicit gains were generally split evenly. The distiller kept about 40 to 50% of the stolen tax money. The other half went into a pool that was divided among the crooked officials. The storekeeper got a cut, the gauger got a cut, the local collector of internal revenue got a significant chunk, and then a portion was sent up the chain to the supervisors. In St. Louis, which was really the beating heart of this conspiracy, the ring was generating tens of thousands of dollars a week in illicit funds. In today's money, we are talking about millions of dollars flowing out of the Treasury and into private pockets every single month. And the man sitting at the center of that St. Louis web was General John McDonald. We touched on him briefly before, but he really deserves a closer look. McDonald was a Grant appointee, a supervisor of internal revenue. He was charming, ruthless, and ostentatious. He drove a carriage with gold-plated harnesses. He wore diamonds. He was living like a king on a civil servant's salary, and nobody seemed to care. He claimed, and this is crucial, that the ring wasn't just about personal greed. He told his subordinates that this was a political necessity. He framed the theft as a fundraising operation for the Republican Party. That was the masterstroke of the whiskey ring. By wrapping themselves in the flag of the Republican Party, they bought themselves an insurance policy. They claimed they were raising a slush fund to ensure President Grant's re-election and to fight the Democrats in key swing states. Now, to be fair, some of the money did go to political campaigns. They paid for rallies, they greased the wheels of local ward bosses, they funded newspapers that wrote favorable editorials about the administration. But the vast majority of it went into buying mansions, racehorses, and luxury goods for the conspirators. But that political cover story is what allowed them to rope in people who might otherwise have been hesitant. They could tell themselves they weren't thieves. They were patriots funding the cause.
It also made them feel untouchable. If you are stealing money to help the President of the United States keep his job, who is going to arrest you? They believed they had the ultimate protection, and for a long time, they were right. They had compromised the press too. The Ring in St. Louis actually bought a newspaper, the St. Louis Globe, just to silence a rival paper that was asking too many questions. When a journalist or a lower-level clerk tried to blow the whistle, the Ring would use its political connections to have that person fired or transferred. It was a closed loop of corruption. However, every closed loop has a breaking point, and for the whiskey ring, that breaking point arrived in the form of Benjamin Bristow. When Grant appointed Bristow as the Secretary of the Treasury in June 1874, the ring probably didn't panic immediately. Bristow was a Republican, a former Solicitor General, a Kentucky lawyer. They likely assumed he was just another party loyalist who would look the other way. They were wrong. Bristow was a tall, imposing man with a stiff spine and a moral compass that pointed true north. Almost immediately after taking office, he noticed the discrepancies. The amount of whiskey being consumed in the United States was rising, but the tax revenue was stagnant or falling. The math simply didn't work. Bristow was in a terrible position, though. He sat in his office in Washington looking at these reports, and he realized he couldn't trust his own department. If he sent a standard team of investigators to St. Louis or Chicago, the local supervisors, the very men running the ring, would know they were coming. They would clean up the books, hide the unstamped barrels, and the investigators would find nothing. Or worse, the investigators would be bribed and join the ring themselves. Bristow realized he was the head of an organization that was rotting from the inside out. So he did something unprecedented. He decided to bypass his own department entirely. He secured a special appropriation of funds from Congress without telling them exactly what it was for, and he built a private intelligence network. He hired outsiders. He hired a solicitor named Bluford Wilson to manage the operation. They recruited trusted associates, private detectives, and even journalists. One of his key agents was a newspaperman named Myron Colony. These men weren't sent in with badges and warrants. They were sent in as spies. They posed as businessmen, as loafers, as potential investors. This really was the birth of modern federal undercover work. Myron Colony, for instance, went to St. Louis and didn't look at the tax records initially. He looked at the shipping manifests. He watched the loading docks at night. He counted the barrels leaving the distilleries and checked them against the freight records of the railroads and steamboats. You see, the ring could fake the tax records, but they couldn't fake the commercial shipping records because the railroads needed to know exactly how much weight they were hauling to bill the customers. Colony found that the railroads were shipping millions of gallons more whiskey than the government was taxing. It was the smoking gun. While Colony was counting barrels in St. Louis, Bristow and Wilson were back in Washington trying to intercept the ring's communications. They knew the conspirators were telegraphing each other to coordinate their fraud, but the messages were in code. They used ciphers where buttons might mean thousands of dollars, or lightning might mean an investigation was imminent. Bristow's team began to intercept these telegrams. They painstakingly pieced together the patterns. They realized that whenever Washington planned a routine inspection, a warning telegram would arrive in St. Louis or Milwaukee or Chicago a few hours before. That confirmed Bristow's worst fear. There was a leak right inside the Treasury Department in Washington. Someone high up was feeding the ring information. This raised the stakes dramatically. Bristow wasn't just hunting corrupt distillers. He was hunting a mole in the Capitol. He kept his circle incredibly small. He didn't even tell the president the full scope of the investigation at first, fearing that Grant, in his naivete or loyalty, might accidentally tip off the wrong person. Grant was known for being too trusting of his friends. Bristow played his cards close to the vest until he was ready to strike, and he planned to strike everywhere at once. The date was set for May 10th, 1875. May 10th was D-Day for the whiskey ring. Bristow coordinated a synchronized series of raids across St. Louis, Chicago, and Milwaukee. He used his secret agents and a handful of trusted U.S. Marshals who had been kept in the dark until the very last moment. When the telegraph wires buzzed that morning, they weren't carrying warnings from the ring.
They were carrying arrest orders. Agents kicked down the doors of distilleries and rectification houses. They seized books, they seized inventory, and they seized the printing plates used to make counterfeit stamps. The surprise was total. General MacDonald in St. Louis was reportedly having breakfast when he heard the news. He laughed it off initially, thinking his connections in Washington would fix it by lunchtime. The arrogance is astounding, isn't it? Even as the handcuffs were coming out, they thought, "We own the president's men. This will go away." But the volume of evidence Bristow's team seized was overwhelming. They had the shipping records, the false ledgers, and the decoded telegrams. In the days following the raids, the scope of the scandal hit the newspapers. It was a sensation. Millions of dollars stolen, dozens of federal officials implicated. But as the investigators sifted through the seized documents, the trail started to point higher than General MacDonald. It pointed to the White House. Specifically, it pointed to a man named Orville Babcock. Orville Babcock wasn't just a secretary. He was General Grant's aide-de-camp during the Civil War. He was the man who had escorted Lee to meet Grant at Appomattox. He lived at the White House. He opened the president's mail. He controlled who got to see Grant and who didn't. He was arguably the second most powerful man in the executive branch because he was the gatekeeper to the president. And his name, or rather his code name, kept popping up in the Ring's correspondence. The investigators found telegrams signed Sylph. At first, they didn't know who Sylph was. Was it a woman, a code for a location? But the context made it clear. Sylph was the person in Washington ensuring the Ring was protected. The investigators matched the handwriting and the dates. Sylph was Orville Babcock. The betrayal was staggering. Here was the man closest to the president, taking diamond shirt studs, expensive liquors, and cash payments from General MacDonald in exchange for tipping off the Ring about federal investigations. There was one particularly damning telegram sent by Babcock to MacDonald just before a planned inquiry. It read, "I have succeeded. They will not go. The guided tour is canceled." This was proof that Babcock had used his influence to stop Treasury agents from inspecting the St. Louis distilleries. He was the leak Bristow had been hunting. When Bristow brought this evidence to President Grant, the reaction was complex. Grant initially took a hard line. This is where he famously wrote the endorsement on a letter regarding the investigation. Let no guilty man escape. It became the rallying cry of the prosecution. Grant seemed ready to purge the corruption, regardless of who it was. But as soon as the finger pointed specifically at Babcock, Grant's demeanor changed. You have to remember, Grant was a man who valued loyalty above almost everything else. He could not believe, or refused to believe, that his brother-in-arms, his trusted friend Orville, was a criminal. He convinced himself that Babcock was the victim of a political witch hunt engineered by Bristow. It became a war within the cabinet. On one side, you had Secretary Bristow and Attorney General Edwards Pierrepont trying to prosecute the Ring. On the other side, you had the President of the United States actively working to undermine the case against his own secretary. Grant started to view Bristow not as a reformer, but as a rival who was using the investigation to launch a presidential bid. And to be fair, Bristow did have presidential ambitions, which only fueled Grant's paranoia. The situation became surreal. The government was prosecuting a case that the head of the government was trying to sabotage.
The tension culminated in the trial of Orville Babcock in St. Louis in February 1876. This was the trial of the century for the Gilded Age. The courtroom was packed. The defense team, paid for by the Ring's illicit funds, came up with what they called the St. Louis defense. Their strategy wasn't to prove Babcock didn't send the telegrams, it was to reinterpret them. They argued that the cryptic messages about succeeding and stopping the agents weren't about tax fraud. No, they claimed these were about something entirely different, something innocent, like political appointments or even bridge construction projects. It was a laughable defense on its face, but they had an ace in the hole. The president. Grant did something that no sitting president had ever done, and none has done since in a criminal trial of this nature. He volunteered to testify for the defense. His cabinet officers begged him not to go to St. Louis. They knew it would be a spectacle and a degradation of his office. So they compromised. Grant gave a deposition at the White House. The Chief Justice supervised it, and the relentless Treasury prosecutors were there to cross-examine him. But let's be honest, crossing the president in his own home is a tall order. In the deposition, Grant suffered a convenient case of amnesia. He couldn't recall details. He insisted that Babcock's telegrams were innocent. He vouched entirely for Babcock's character. That deposition was read aloud in the St. Louis courtroom. Imagine the impact on the jury. You are a juror in 1876, and you hear the hero of the Civil War, the President of the United States, swearing under oath that the defendant is an honest man and that the prosecutors are mistaken. It was game over.
Despite a mountain of documentary evidence, despite the Dakota telegrams, despite the testimony of other conspirators who had turned state's evidence, the jury acquitted Orville Babcock. He walked free. But it was a hollow victory. Everyone in the room, everyone in the country who read the transcripts knew he was guilty. The acquittal was a testament to Grant's influence, not Babcock's innocence. The aftermath was immediate and brutal. Babcock was acquitted, yes, but he couldn't go back to his old job. The public outcry was too deafening. Grant had to force him to resign as private secretary just days after the trial. As for Benjamin Bristow, his position became untenable. The friction with Grant was too intense. He resigned as Treasury Secretary in June 1876. The man who had exposed the corruption was pushed out, while the man who had enabled it was protected by the president. It's a tragic irony. Bristow tried to run for president that year, positioning himself as the reform candidate, but the machine politics he had fought against rallied to stop him. However, we shouldn't think the whiskey ring got away with it entirely. While Babcock skated, dozens of others did not. General MacDonald went to prison, scores of distillers and lower-level officials were convicted. The government recovered millions of dollars in fines and settlements. But more importantly, the scandal shattered the illusion of the Gilded Age. It showed the American public that the economic boom was being fueled by a rot at the core of the government. It contributed heavily to the fatigue the country felt with Reconstruction and Republican rule, eventually paving the way for the fiercely contested election of 1876 and the end of the Grant era. Let's dig a little deeper into the specific mechanics of the trial, because the Sylph telegram wasn't the only piece of evidence. There was the Walnut Bureau incident. Investigators found that Babcock had received a very expensive ornate walnut desk and liquor cabinet from the St. Louis conspirators. When questioned about it, the defense claimed it was just a friendly gift between gentlemen. But the prosecution produced shipping records showing the timing of the gift coincided exactly with the moment when Babcock had intervened to stop a transfer of honest agents into the St. Louis district. It was a classic bribe, a piece of furniture for a piece of policy.
And we can't overlook the role of the letterpress copies. In those days, businessmen and officials kept copies of their outgoing correspondence by pressing the wet ink of a handwritten letter against a tissue paper page in a bound book. It created a reverse image copy. When the raiders hit the offices of the conspirators, they seized these letter books. The ring had tried to destroy them. There are reports of men frantically tearing pages out of books and shoving them into pot-bellied stoves as the marshals were banging on the doors, but they couldn't burn them all. The Treasury agents spent months holding these tissue pages up to mirrors to read the reverse text, reconstructing the conspiracy day by day, dollar by dollar. That image of the agents reading mirrored text really highlights the forensic accounting aspect of this. It wasn't just about spies, it was about data. Bristow's team was effectively doing modern data analysis with pen and paper. They correlated the purchase of tax stamps with the output of mash. Distilling is a chemical process. You can't cheat physics. If you buy X amount of grain, you produce Y amount of alcohol. The ring tried to hide the grain purchases, but they forgot that the grain sellers kept their own books. Bristow subpoenaed the corn merchants. When he saw that a distillery bought 50,000 bushels of corn but only paid tax on 10,000 bushels worth of whiskey, the math was irrefutable. It was the Al Capone strategy of tax evasion prosecution, 50 years before Capone. Let's circle back to Grant's psychology in this. Why did he protect Babcock so fiercely? Historians have debated this for a century. Was Grant corrupt? Most evidence says no, he didn't personally profit from the whiskey ring. He died nearly broke after all. But he had a fatal flaw. He viewed the presidency through the lens of a military commander. In the army, if a subordinate is accused by an outsider, you defend your man until proven otherwise. You circle the wagons. Bristow's investigation not as a legal process, but as an insubordinate attack on his staff. He took it personally. He reportedly told his cabinet, "If Babcock is guilty, then I am guilty." He meant it as a defense of Babcock's character, but in the eyes of the public, it sounded like an admission of complicity. That loyalty blinded him to the reality that he was being used. The conspirators played Grant like a fiddle. They knew he loved horses, so they gifted him expensive thoroughbred equipment. They knew he enjoyed cigars and fine whiskey, so they kept the White House stocked. They invited him to St. Louis for fairgrounds dedications and treated him like a demigod. General MacDonald was particularly good at this. He became a friend of the family. So when Bristow came in with dry ledgers and cold facts, he was up against warm personal friendship. It's a timeless lesson in how access equals influence. Babcock didn't need to bribe Grant. He just needed to be the guy who lit his cigar and listened to his war stories. There was also a darker political element. The ring threatened to take the party down with them.
During the investigation, there were veiled threats that if the administration pushed too hard, the conspirators would reveal other scandals, other slush funds. It was a game of chicken. Bristow was willing to crash the car to catch the thieves. Grant wanted to keep the car on the road for the sake of the party's stability. This friction paralyzed the administration for the last 2 years of Grant's term. Instead of focusing on Reconstruction or the economy, the White House was consumed by legal battles and damage control. It's worth noting the specific defense tactics used in the Babcock trial regarding the telegraphs. The defense brought in expert witnesses who claimed that the language in the telegrams was standard business shorthand. They tried to normalize the corruption. When Babcock wrote, "The skunk is dead," referring to a troublesome investigator, the defense argued he was just using a colloquialism for a problem being solved. The prosecution argued, correctly, that federal officials shouldn't be referring to their own agents as skunks. But the jury, handpicked and likely influenced by the political machine in St. Louis, bought the explanation, or pretended to.
The sheer scale of the network meant that the jury pool itself was tainted. In St. Louis, almost everyone knew someone involved in the whiskey trade. It was a major industry. Convicting the ring meant hurting the local economy. It's similar to trying to get a conviction against the mafia in a town they run. The foreman of the jury was later suspected of having ties to the ring. So Bristow wasn't just fighting the defendants, he was fighting the venue. This is why he tried to have the trials moved, but the defense successfully argued for them to stay in the district where the crimes occurred. That was a critical legal defeat for the prosecution. And we have to talk about the safe burglary conspiracy that happened adjacent to this. It's a subplot that often gets forgotten. In an attempt to frame the whistleblower Columbus Alexander, members of the District of Columbia ring actually hired men to blow open a safe in the U.S. Attorney's office and plant false evidence. They wanted to make it look like the reformers were the criminals. It sounds like something out of a bad spy novel, but it actually happened. It shows the level of desperation. These weren't white-collar criminals quietly cooking books. They were willing to use explosives and frame-ups to protect their income. That desperation came from the top. General MacDonald, once he realized he was going to prison, actually threatened to write a tell-all book implicating Grant directly. And he did write it, eventually, titled Secrets of the Great Whiskey Ring. In it, he claimed Grant knew everything. Now, historians generally regard MacDonald's book as the revenge fantasy of a convicted felon. It's full of exaggerations and lies. But the fact that it existed and that people bought it shows how much damage was done to the presidency. Grant left office with his reputation in tatters, largely because of this scandal. It took decades for his reputation to recover. The sad part is, the whiskey ring scandal overshadowed Grant's genuine achievements. He crushed the KKK. He established the first national park. He stabilized the currency. But for 50 years, if you opened a history textbook, the first thing it said about Grant was corruption. The whiskey ring became the defining feature of his administration in the public memory. It's a cautionary tale about the company you keep. Grant was an honest man surrounded by thieves, but in politics there is no distinction. If your table is full of crooks, you are the head of a crook's table. Let's analyze the financial impact one last time. The millions stolen, estimates range from $3 million to perhaps as high as $4 million a year, would be the equivalent of losing hundreds of millions of dollars today. This was a significant percentage of the federal budget. The United States government was still paying off the massive debt from the Civil War. Every dollar stolen by the ring was a dollar that couldn't go to veterans' pensions, or to reconstruction efforts in the South, or to infrastructure. It wasn't a victimless crime. It was a direct theft from the American people at a time when the country was financially fragile. And the raid on May 10, 1875 remains one of the most successful federal law enforcement operations in history. Think about the logistics. No radios, no internet, no cars, just telegraphs and pocket watches. To coordinate agents in 3 different states to hit dozens of targets at the exact same hour required military-level precision. It was Bristow's masterpiece. Even though the political fallout was messy, the operation itself was flawless. It proved that the federal government could reach into the local fiefdoms of corrupt bosses and enforce the law. It established the supremacy of the Treasury Department. It also revolutionized the concept of the civil service. Before this, the spoils system was the law of the land. You won the election, you gave every job to your friends, regardless of their qualifications or honesty. The whiskey ring was the ultimate product of the spoils system. MacDonald had no business being a supervisor. He was a political hack. After the scandal, the cry for civil service reform became deafening. It took a few more years and the assassination of President Garfield, but the Pendleton Act was eventually passed to stop exactly this kind of cronyism. In a way, we have the whiskey ring to thank for the modern professional civil service.
That's a generous way to look at it, but accurate. Sometimes you need a disaster to prompt a safety regulation. The whiskey ring was the Titanic of political corruption. It was too big to ignore. It forced the system to change. But for the men involved, it was a tragedy. Orville Babcock drowned in a storm off the coast of Florida a few years later while inspecting lighthouses, a minor government job given to him by a later administration. A strange end for a man who once controlled access to the president. And Benjamin Bristow, the hero of the story, he never became president. He moved to New York, practiced law, and became a founder of the American Bar Association. He faded into history, a man who did the right thing and paid the political price for it. History has been kind to him, though. He is remembered as one of the few beacons of integrity in the Gilded Age. His legacy is the integrity of the Treasury. Every time you see a tax stamp or a regulated barrel of spirits today, that system is secure because of the battles Bristow fought in 1875. So, what is the final verdict on the whiskey ring? It was a conspiracy of opportunity, born from a flawed tax system and a culture of political patronage. It was sustained by the naive loyalty of a president and the cunning of his subordinates. It ended because a few men decided that their oath of office meant more than their party affiliation. It's a story of greed, yes, but also a story of detection, of codes in ciphers, and of the limits of friendship in the Oval Office. Ultimately, the whiskey ring teaches us that vigilance is the price of honest government. As long as there are taxes, there will be those who try to evade them, and as long as there is power, there will be those who try to buy it. The barrels of whiskey in St. Louis may be long gone, drunk and forgotten, but the mechanics of the fraud, the kickbacks, the cover-ups, the slush funds, these are ghosts that still haunt the halls of power today. It is a chapter of history we forget at our own peril.